Um, One of the things that I do in the translation, like John Goldingay, is to, in a sense, stun readers into a different way of saying what they're already familiar with.
Hello, I'm Rick Jordan, President of Great Bible Teachers. I have the opportunity and the joy of interviewing scholars and authors and practitioners when it comes to the Bible, biblical interpretation, and spiritual formation. I'm delighted to share with you the interview that I had with Scot McKnight. Scot is professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Illinois. He has written dozens and dozens of books, including many excellent commentaries on different books of the Bible. And now he has written his own translation of the New Testament. So we talk about translation, how the translator thinks about what words to put on the page, and his hopes for what the translation will do for the church. I hope you enjoy this interview. Who has been a great Bible teacher in your life, and why would you categorize them in that way?
Well, I've had a number of them, I have to admit, including a college professor, but I had a seminary professor named Murray J. Harris who taught Greek exegesis. And he was pious. He was reverent with the text. He was respectful of his students and rigorously demanding in the kindest of ways with his students. So he expected us not only to master the Greek text. I remember that he taught us 2 Corinthians. Not only master the text, but the issues involved in the text. He could look at a problem, let's say, in one paragraph, in one verse, with one expression, and turn the entire passage upside down. And he just modeled for me careful exegesis, careful study of the Bible, along with a commitment to live before God as a Bible scholar. So he studied the Bible as a part of his worship and discipleship, rather than after he finished studying the Bible, he went out and lived a Christian life. So he's a wonderful man. He was a New Zealander. I had him in the United States, and then he was the warden at Tyndale House in Cambridge, England, where when I studied there, he was the warden, and it was great to be with him again. Then he returned to Trinity for a while, and I had him as a colleague, very helpful as a colleague. And then he went back to New Zealand, and I was lecturing in New Zealand and got to see him and his wife again. And he was very impactful for me.
Wow, that sounds like it. And it's so neat that you were able to, your life wove together so many times. That is amazing and great.
Yeah.
So you have written for us, I'm not sure how well it'll show on the Zoom, but the Second Testament, and I've got a better picture of it we'll look at in just a minute. But so I see a lot of books behind you. I'm assuming a lot of them are Bibles. I've got a lot of Bibles behind my head here, a lot of translations. And yet we have a new one. What was the call to you to do a new translation for us?
Well, I have a friend that everybody knows. His name is Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, and he translated the New Testament. It became the Kingdom New Testament, but he did it in preparation for a little series of books called the Bible for Everyone. It's a little daily devotional reflection. It wasn't devotional, it was reflection on the text. Well, they did the same in the Old Testament with a man named John Goldingay. He did a translation of the Old Testament. It's a lot bigger task to translate the Old Testament than the New. And then he did this Bible for Everyone. Then they published them together, and I had not seen his translation until I saw it published together in England. And then in the United States, InterVarsity got the rights to publish John Goldingay's Old Testament, and it was called the First Testament. Well, I had the bound volume of Goldingay and Wright, the Bible for Everyone, and I was using it a bit. I wasn't crazy about the production of the book itself, but InterVarsity produced a beautiful edition of the First Testament, and I began to read it. I've now read it almost entirely 3 times. Well, I saw the editor at InterVarsity one day, and they owned the rights to the Old Testament. And we got to talking about it. He's an Old Testament scholar. And I said, I really like Goldingay and I like Tom Wright, but I said they don't belong together because they have 2 completely different theories of translation. Now, this was just my opinion,
Yeah.
And he says to me, we talked about this. What do you mean by this? So I went through some things, but then he said, what do you think we should do about it? I said, I think you should get someone to translate the New Testament as a second testament, like John Goldingay's First Testament. And he's looked at me and he said, would you do it? And I looked at him and I said, yes. So there you go. It took just a few months. Within a year, I began translating. Well, it was before that because I had to send in a sample. Probably 9 months later, I sent in a sample. They approved it. We worked out all the details of how to do it all. And I began to translate in the fall. And it took me 2 years before I submitted it. It took me about 18, 19 months to translate it. Then I redid the whole thing in light of my own translation to edit it and everything. And so it started that way. And John Goldingay had a distinct approach to translation that cohered with some things I like to do when I'm teaching the New Testament, is to help people see what the Greek text looks like. And he did it with the Hebrew text. I thought I could do it with the Greek text. So that's why it's called Second Testament, and that's why it's translated the way it is.
Yeah. So because the First Testament had been done. So what types of things did you pick up from his Old Testament translation that you thought, I want to carry this idea into the New Testament translation?
Well, a couple things. The first one would be that it is much more word for word than any Old Testament translation that I had seen. And it wasn't because he believed that the thought for thought or the dynamic equivalence translations are inaccurate. It's just that this is another way of doing it that'll help Bible readers. So that was one thing. It was much more, and so therefore it wasn't as smooth in English. So my editor called it chunky, and I like that word. Clunky is the word I used. He said, maybe chunky. The second thing is he transliterates names as a way of respecting what that name sounded like in that culture. So I did the same thing when I translated names in the New Testament. So it's Jesus, Ioannes, Petros, not Jesus, John, or Peter.
Right.
Mary is not difficult. Maria and Mariam. And the third thing is that well, I guess I combined my 3 points right there. But the big idea is that he's created a translation designed for people who read their Bibles and who are looking for a different experience. They're looking for a translation that will do something different than what they've already seen, and it will crack their familiarity with their own translation. So let's just say a more word for word, a transliteration, and the attempt to give people a different experience that will help them understand their own translation. But it's not, for instance, someone asked me, is this a pulpit Bible? No, the First and Second Testament probably are not. They're a little bit harder to read in public because we use things in the text that are not as easily transmissible when you're speaking. But at the same time, we hope that those who are familiar with the text will find this to be a helpful supplemental translation.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with this translation because,
well, thank you.
As I've been reading through it, there are just ahas throughout it for me. And then also there are, I'm like, okay, what about this passage? I wonder how he put this passage. And so what I've done is look at some of these passages that I've been particularly interested in, and some popular passages, you might say, greatest hits of the New Testament, and seeing how you did some of those. So what I'd like to do is to share the screen here. Here we go. All right. Are you able to see the picture of the cover?
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So this is the cover itself, and I think it's a handsome volume. It's relatively small. As you say, New Testament's a lot smaller than the Old Testament.
I couldn't believe it when I opened up the box. I thought, this is all it is? This is but then I opened it up and it's 319 pages or something.
Yeah.
And so it is a fairly good sized book, but small print and small and thin paper.
Yeah.
And 2 columns can give you a pretty thin Bible.
Get a lot in there though.
Yeah.
This is the cover without the dust jacket. As you can see, again, very attractive, I think. And then you get into there's actually a prologue that you've written, or a preface that you've written, and that explains a lot of how you came about writing it, and the theory behind what you did. And I'm hoping that as we just glance through some passages that that will come out. So here, the Gospel of Matthew, we start off Jesu's heritage. So we start off with Jesus being named something different. And then the book of Genesis of Jesus. Right there, it's like, what? That's a different way of phrasing that.
Yeah. Well, the Greek word genesis, that's what the Greek word actually is there too,
Yeah.
But one of the things that I do in the translation, like John Goldingay, is to, in a sense, stun readers into a different way of saying what they're already familiar with. So everybody has the book of the genealogy of Jesus. Okay. It's a word so familiar to people that they skip right over it and don't pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the translation theory of Goldingay, it's probably something I could have mentioned earlier, is to use translations that will surprise the reader, that are what could be called minority glosses or minority translations that have always been in the dictionaries or the lexicons, always are in the commentaries, but never show up in the translations, because translations are traditional and conservative. And to change a word, you risk getting yourself in trouble with everyone. So I changed everything. So
that's an advantage, isn't it, to being a one-man translation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When it's a committee, you're going to have to go toward the consensus of the committee. And if the committee is, let's just say, I'll just put this out there and not try to get myself in trouble, a bunch of white guys who are evangelicals, who all went to evangelical seminaries and teach in evangelical institutions, it's pretty likely that the consensus is going to be what the evangelicals expect to see in that text.
Right.
And so an individual can be riskier, and I'm definitely riskier.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
And then, likewise, just in verse 2, Abram gave a life to Yitzhak.
Yeah.
Gave a life.
Yeah.
We're so used to beget.
Yeah, that's right. And and I think some have at times was a father of. But the Greek word genao. Now here's something, Rick, that was important to me. And this is something that John Goldingay tried to do as well. We can't be always successful, but we try, is to give one English expression or word to each Greek word. So this Greek word is genao. And, I have to look up every time it occurs in the New Testament and find a translation that I think will work with every instance. Well, that's fine if it occurs 2 times. But if it occurs 145, it's a little bit more time consuming. But that's the care that I had to take in translating. And genao means, in a sense, to give a life to give birth to. And I really like this translation. Abraham gave a life to Yitzhak.
Yeah.
There's the transliterated names. I think it does something. I think it emphasizes that word life, and that's what genao is all about: giving life to, giving a new life to something. So
yeah, I think I was raised, as many of us probably were, on King James Version before there were a lot more other translations, and begat to me just meant had. Abraham had Isaac.
It actually means more than that, but that's how familiar it was.
Yes.
And familiarity is the biggest problem in translation.
Yeah.
So many times I had to resist the familiar in order to see what the text actually said, because I already know what the text says because I'm familiar with the text.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
let's look at another passage, and this is obviously the very beginning of Genesis, of Matthew, where Jesus is born, and his mother Maria being engaged to Joseph before they had assembled.
Yes. Now this is one that people go, well, I don't know, and I can, but this is the same word used in the New Testament before they had come together, sun erchomai, and I just moved. I thought this would be, they came together,
Yeah. I thought, when I was a youth minister, we often preached about no premarital assembly.
There you go. That's right.
But then, like in verse 20 there, we have what you're saying, where things are not smooth reading. You have an ellipsis, and different tenses.
The ellipses are very common in the Gospels and the book of Acts. And that is because these are genitive absolutes in Greek. Now, a genitive absolute, I understand that a lot of people don't have a clue what that is, but it is an expression at the beginning of a sentence, usually at the beginning, not always, where the subject of that expression or clause is not the subject of the verb of the main sentence. So it is another way of saying this is a suspended verbal clause that begins a sentence. And, the NIV probably says, while Joseph was pondering these things, behold, the Lord's angel appeared to him in a dream. Okay. They tie the two together as an introductory verbal clause, but they're genitive absolutes, and a genitive absolute is not to be tied together. It's a peculiar thing about Greek that I think my readers will say, yes, that's peculiar, and that gives them a feel for what the Greek actually does. It is a suspended clause, and that's why there are ellipses. And I use look instead of the word behold.
Gold. Yeah.
Lo and behold. Yeah.
So another passage we all know is the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer. But I like how you have Jesus introducing it again. Praying, don't jabber.
Well, the Greek word here is a word that is sort of making fun of what it sounds like. So batalageo, and it's sort of onomatopoetic is what it is. It sort of sounds like what you're doing. So I thought that was a pretty good translation. I smile when I see that. Don't jabber along like the ethnic groups, the Gentiles, for they think they will be heard in their endless words. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
And Rick, I asked my editor. I had 3 different editors. One of them was moved off the thing. Another one took a job at another publisher. So over the time, I had 3 different editors. I asked my second editor if I could use the King James Version for the Lord's Prayer, and she told me I couldn't.
Oh,
I said, well, that's the only one we pray in church, isn't it?
I know.
So I had to translate it.
Yeah. And so it's like, but like you said before, this is not a translation that is designed to be memorized or read from the pulpit or something. It is designed to catch you by surprise when you read it, I think.
Yeah.
And so and you have in verse 10 there, we always say your kingdom come, which has become numb to us. And so when you say your empire come, it's like, oh, what does that mean?
Well, here's something that's interesting, and you've said this exactly right. I've been teaching I'm in my 4th decade. Okay. So I'm stunned when I ask my seminary audiences, even my classes, what does the word kingdom in the teachings of Jesus mean? And they can't define it, but they love it. They love the term. And I'm stunned by the number of people who are really committed to the Gospels, but don't define what kingdom means. So I wanted to defamiliarize people with the word kingdom and try a different term that had the same kind of expansive sense of God as the sovereign ruler over all creation. And the only word that comes to mind at that time is the word empire. So I use the word empire, and I've heard that, I haven't seen it, I don't pay attention to it, but I've heard that there are some social media sites that are irritated that I use the word empire. But I feel like this. I feel like if you don't like that translation, as you see it, you're thinking what translation you prefer. And then I feel like I have accomplished my purpose of making you think about the text more carefully.
Right.
So
I love that.
Yeah.
We have Jesus commissions here.
Yeah.
And he has 12 apprentices. Again, just a word selection that is not normal for us to hear.
Yeah. Okay, this was a difficult one for me, in part because I love the word disciple and I like the word discipleship. Okay, I grew up and we were Christians. And when I went to college, I began to read the Gospels because my home church didn't read the Gospels. We read the Pauline letters. And I learned all about discipleship. And all of a sudden, there were discipleship programs in churches. And I feel like I got to live with that experience in churches in the evangelical movement. But I do think that the word disciple is so familiar to people today that I wanted to try a different term. And this is one of the terms that I think really captures a different angle on this. Because I don't think a lot of people define discipleship quite right. An apprentice is someone who is learning from a master so that that person can go and do what the master has taught them to do and carry it to the next level. That's what the disciples are called to do. I think with the word disciple, we think almost exclusively in terms of following Jesus rather than carrying on the work of Jesus. And I think apprentice will do that. Plus, I have a friend in Wichita named James Bryan Smith, who has an apprentice institute. And I really like what he's doing. And I thought this term will evoke the experience that many of us have when we're with James Bryan Smith.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah, I agree. When I ran across him and his use of that word, it was enlightening to me to rethink about it. And then you have commissioners as well.
Okay. This was a difficult one because this is such an important word in the history of the church. Apostle. All right, what's an apostle? The Greek word means to send out, to stand out. In Hebrew, it meant a shaliach is someone who is sent. And I don't think that the word apostle in English connotes that sense of being sent. You have to be told that that's what it means. Whereas the word commission is really clear. We know what commissioners are. Furthermore, apostle has become religious for us. In the first century, it wasn't religious. It was someone that Jesus gathered around to be an apprentice. And once they had been, let's say, semi-apprenticed into the work of the kingdom, the empire of God, he sent them out. He commissioned them. And I don't think that's connoted for many people when they see the word apostle. So I tried commissioner, and we'll see if people like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the names, we have the names, and in your preface, you mentioned this too, that we have the name of James here, but it's Jacobus. And so it's really Jacob, isn't it?
It is. And this is one of the things that John Goldingay's translation really got going for me. I really liked it. And some of those names in the Hebrew Bible are really long, and we have reduced them. But what he made me realize is how we have colonized ancient Israelite names into an English term, an English name that doesn't have the same resonance that it had in that ancient Israel or Hebrew word. And now most of them, you can see Philippos. It actually means someone who loves horses. You can't see that with the word Philip unless you look it up in a dictionary. But Jacobos makes you think of Jacob in the patriarchs. And that's who James was named after.
Yeah.
But the word James does not suggest that at all.
Right.
And that's what happens when we colonize other people's names in a foreign language. I think there's something for us to learn in what we're doing to people's native land and country when we usurp their name for a similar name in our language. So this was a real challenge at times because a lot of people don't see these, and it's going to be confusing. But I put in brackets the first time that name is used in each chapter. just like John Goldingay did.
Okay. You also you have headings that kind of teach you as you go along. In this text anyway, in Matthew, we have speech 1, we have narrative 2. I've just kind of turned the page there so that we can see both. And there's also a map that goes across the page, so you're only seeing half of it here. But the speech 1 and narrative 2, it hints at literary structure, that this was written. It wasn't just a random collection of stories. There was a structure to it.
And I think the structure to the Gospel of Matthew is exceedingly obvious. And if you're reading a standard English translation that has red letters and black letters, you can see this. It'll be all, pages of red letters, then black letters, then red letters, then black letters. Not all books have this sort of structure in them. Some of them do. And I only put it in when I thought it was really obvious. Like I didn't do it in the letters, like the salutation, and then I didn't put the body of the letter. I think that's rather obvious and a little bit meaningless. But in Matthew, I thought this could be helpful to people who are reading. So,
yeah. Let me move on to Mark. This is the end of Mark, where again you have that in the very first verse, the Sabbaths elapsing, and then Maria the Magdalene, etc.
Magdalene.
Yeah.
Yes, that opening, the Sabbath elapsing, that is a rather unique word in Mark. It's not common. So I wanted to use an uncommon word in English, and it's a genitive absolute again, so it gets those ellipses. Maria the Magdalena, that's her name in Greek, and Maria of Yoses and Salome purchased spices, so coming, they might oil him. Every now and then I use nouns for verbs just to, because we don't, let's say put oil on him uses 3 words or 2 words, and oil, I think oiling something is, I know this works because I've oiled tires on my bicycles,
Right.
or the axles. So
right.
Yeah.
And then the very last sentence of Mark 2, exiting, they fled from the tomb, for they had tremble and ecstasy, and they said nothing to no one, for they were scared.
Yeah.
That just captures it,
And it's kind of terse the way Mark's grammar is. That's part of it. And they had tremble. Instead of, it's a noun rather than trembling, which is how many people would translate it in English. And that's okay. But I wanted to, I know they had tremble. Most people wouldn't say tremble's a noun quite like that, but I used it. And ecstasy, that's a transliteration basically of the Greek word ekstasis. That sort of means to fall apart. And they said nothing to no one. I think some translations would get rid of the NOs, say they didn't say anything to anyone. And then phobeo is an important Greek word. It's usually translated fear, for they were afraid. I used scare. Now, this is an interesting illustration of part of the translation theory. 1 Greek word, 1 English word. Okay, the Greek word is phobeo. The word I chose is scare, but it doesn't always work, because sometimes phobeo means to have awe before God. So at times I don't use the word scare. I use the word awe, and but I don't use the word fear, unless if I did, it's a mistake on my part because of familiarity.
Yeah. I've been working on John. I write curriculum and have been working on the Gospel of John. And one of the things that I found, again, like you were saying, in the commentaries, there would be this comment, but I didn't find a translation that did it until I've come across yours, which is here at the end of chapter 2, that at the Passover, many trusted in his name. Well, two things. First, many trusted in his name, observing his authenticating signs that he was doing. Jesus himself did not trust himself to them because he knew all. So you got the
Same Greek word.
The trust word there.
Mhm.
And then he knew all because he was having no need that someone witness about a human, for he knew what was in the human. And then verse 3 picks up, there was a human of the observant Pharisees, or the observant. Like Jesus, John's telling us Jesus knew all. He knew people. He knew the insides of people. And here was a people.
Here was a people.
It's like his first illustration of a human that Jesus knew inside and out, even though Nicodemus himself maybe didn't realize that.
Let's go back to that word trust. The Greek word, the verb is pisteuo. And this is another one of these words where I just couldn't pull it off. So I use two different English words, to trust and to have allegiance, because trust in the New Testament doesn't just mean a single act of trust. It means an ongoing trust. And that's sort of allegiance. And I really like Matt Bates's book, friend of mine who's written a book on allegiance. So Jesus, they trusted in his name, but he didn't trust himself to them. And that means hand himself over and trust them with himself. So he does that. But it is important to see how John is using words over and over. Trust goes to trust, and then human goes to human, and then human goes to human again.
Yeah.
And when you use the same English word for the same Greek word, those sorts of things begin to show up. But in most English translations, they find natural English equivalents, even if that means changing an author's word to a different English word. And this is why the famous Italian statement is, all translators are traitors. Traduttori, tratatori. And that's the idea, is that I wanted readers, the readers of the Second Testament, to see that these are the same words used in, they're sort of like catchwords from one line to another. And they can see that, but I don't think they see that in all English translations.
No.
And I'm particularly happy with my translation of the word Pharisee with the word observant.
Yeah.
I have a Jewish friend and she's a very good scholar. She isn't crazy about this, because she says you Christians need to change what you think of Pharisees. And I said, well, I think I'm playing my part by not letting people see the word Pharisee and think they're negative stereotype. So I use the word observant, but once I put in brackets Pharisees, they all know what I'm doing. But observant means that a Pharisee is someone who observes the law according to their tradition. That's what a Pharisee is. And it's not a hypocrite.
Yeah.
That's not what Pharisee means, but that's what it means in English. But you can't use the word observant and mean hypocrite. So I feel like I've won on that one.
Yeah, that's great. I don't have a picture of this, but one of the things I like on your headings, when Jesus is talking about you are the salt of the world, and you've got Jesus likes salt.
John Goldingay has some translations. I wasn't as clever as he was. He loves rock music, so he has some rock music allusions. I don't have many, but one thing I hope people notice, they won't, but I hope they do. Every paragraph in all four Gospels, every heading starts with the word Jesus.
Oh.
All the passages are about Jesus, not about us.
Uh-huh.
So that made me use a lot of repetitive things like Jesus heals or something like that.
Oh,
But yeah, that was important to me. I wanted to make sure people see that this passage is about Jesus.
yeah. So moving on, Acts, you mentioned in your prologue, excuse me, your preface, that that Acts was a more difficult book to translate. I believe you said that it was a different level of language, I guess, than a lot of the other books of the Bible.
I don't know where you're from, Rick, but I'm from the Midwest. Okay, so I tell my students that Mark is from Indiana, Matthew is from Illinois, which is basically about the same, but I like to say Illinois is a little better than Indiana. But Luke is from the East Coast, more Ivy League. So for the New Testament writers, Luke's Greek is among the finest. And when you put together Luke and Acts, he's the best. The only thing that is close would be the pastoral epistles, First Peter at times, which is more like Paul, but it's at times it exceeds Paul, and the book of Hebrews. The Greek level is significantly higher. And I wanted readers to get a feel for the sophistication of Luke, even though that's not as conveyable in English as maybe I originally thought I could pull off. But maybe people will feel it at times.
Yeah.
But that's quite the beginning to a gospel. And I had to ask for special formatting. I don't know how they did it to put this all in centered in the text. And I really like what they did with it because it gives that sense of what it feels like in Greek. This is something very special that begins the text, and this will make them feel that.
In Paul's letters, at least in First Corinthians and in Galatians, one thing I noticed,
and Romans
and Romans, like you have in bold, like questions that were asked that Paul is responding to.
Okay, this was hard to get the publishers to quite see what I was doing, but I think a lot of the question and answer session back and forth that Paul has is missed when we have it all in the same font. It's almost like the questions are a part of the logical flow when they're a little bit more interruptive in two different ways. Number one, the reader, this text would have been read aloud, and when a question was asked, there would have been a pause for people to answer questions. So these are all separate lines. So you have to stop a little bit to get to them. And then I wanted to call attention to a question versus an answer. Now, because I made the commitment to do this, some of the questions are probably given more space in bold than they deserve, that they could have been just a part of the answer. But when that I think people can see that when they are actually the answers. Paul can answer his own questions with questions. But I'm proud of this because I also think, especially in the book of Romans and in First Corinthians, Paul is actually answering questions that he's being asked. Or I would say this, he's re-expressing the questions that people are asking him. So he kind of puts them in his own words. and then he answers them. And so there's a lot of question and answer going on in the book of Romans in very distinct ways, and in First Corinthians. So I hope that the people will get an experience of a question and answer format.
Yeah. I think this is where it just pops out, It's like you said, the same font doesn't do it, but here, and then occasionally you also have these lists that you've pulled out, almost bulleted.
Yes. I like those lists. It slows you down to see that this is actually a list. I mean, in Greek, it is not a list because they didn't even have commas between words. They didn't even have spaces between words because they're trying to consume that, a piece of papyrus was expensive. But when they are a list, I thought it deserves to be a list. It'll get people to see what's there.
Yeah. And then a thing that stood out for me in Galatians also is how Paul addresses them. So in chapter 3, verse 1, you've got him saying, "Oh, brainless Galatia."
Galati, yeah.
Galati.
Yeah.
In 4:19, you have him call them my children. But then in 5:26, now I think this is quotable. You have him saying, "Let's not become airheads." That's a bumper sticker there.
That's right. Let us not become airheads. Yeah, I like that translation. There are times when you use a translation, you think it's lighthearted, but that's the kind of word that was used there. So,
yeah, so it fits.
Yeah.
Just a few more slides. I just wanted to look at a few more passages with the Ephesians. The thing that stood out to me in reading, I didn't read your introduction first. I just started with Ephesians, and you have a blank. Like who's it written to? Even though it says above there in the title, obviously to the Ephesians.
Well, I was influenced by a man named Ernest Best, who has written on this several times. Is that if you study the textual tradition of Ephesians 1:1, it's probable that this letter did not say to Ephesus, but that Ephesus was one of the churches that received it. And it's also noticeable that this letter doesn't have a bunch of those names that are in the letter that his normal letters do. So I think this was a cyclical or circular letter, that it was expected to go from one church to another. And that when the reader got to a house church and read, they would have said to Colossae or to Ephesus. They would have filled in the city church, or the name of the city in which the church was. So I did that. And this is very well known in people who study the book of Ephesians, but it's a bit risky in a translation. So the translations sort of put it in the footnote, that it isn't in all the text. So I said, okay, I'll let the minority reading come into the text and let people experience what that looks like. So glad you noticed it.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing I noticed was because this is where, when I had Greek, Ephesians was one of the books we translated. And so this is what I remembered, because chapter 1 was my chapter to translate, and how it's like these impossibly long sentences that in other translations, this is 10 sentences or something, but
they're verses.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I showed the indentation, I think, of the subordinate levels that are going on. So
yeah,
I like how I translate Ephesians, and I hope people will see how this all works together. But it is one long, from verses 3 through 14 is one long sentence.
Yeah. And then in the next chapter, in the next passage, again, a long sentence. And that's the way Paul wrote. But you don't know that if it's written as 10 sentences.
Yeah.
So
I titled the blessing in Ephesians 1, 3.
Yeah.
One long blessing.
Yeah.
So
I like the introductions. You've got introductions for different sections, and then for the different chapter, or excuse me, different books of the Bible. I want to move on here. Just Apocolypse you've got rather than Revelation.
yeah. Well, it is an apocalypse. That's what the Greek word is.
Mhm.
And we have to tell everybody that the Greek word is apocalypto, and it means to unveil or to reveal. And so this will just bring into most people's Bibles this word apocalypse. And I use this as a verb in the New Testament as well, to apocalypse something.
Ah,
So I do that just so people will see how frequently this Greek word actually appears. So, yeah.
so finally, at the very end, you have a 2.5 pages of glossary that
Yeah.
help us see what you've done. Some with the translation with some of these words, and how you have used them, reused them in different ways. So um, that's all I'm going to share with this. But I just wanted to have this opportunity to chat with you about it, because to me it's just a wonderful work. That was 2 years very well spent and 40 years of practicing on it before
Well,
doing.
thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
As we close, I just wonder, as I say, my audience basically has been laypersons who are teaching the Bible. I just wonder if there's a question I should have asked, excuse me, that I didn't ask, that would be helpful, or if you have a word of wisdom or encouragement to share.
Well, no, it's not that you didn't ask questions. You asked good questions, and it was fun to see all these slides on here. This was fun for me.
Good.
Um, the I would say that people are doing a noble work is teaching the Bible. We have wandered from adult Bible classes to adult study groups that read books by other people instead of studying the Bible. You know, if the book is like I've written the Everyday Bible Studies, these are books about the Bible. Um, I think that the evangelical church has wandered from its biblical faith because it doesn't read the Bible enough. So what they're doing is noble. Stick with the Bible, go through the Bible books and teach the Bible. That's a good thing.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate your time and all you're giving to us.
Well, thank you, Rick. Wonderful to be with you. Wonderful interview.
Thank you.